Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, we're going to be talking about the multiverse and how it can be used as a response to arguments from evil. My guest is Dr. Klaas Kraay. He is a professor of philosophy at Ryerson University. He's been on the channel several times now, so I hope he looks familiar to you. Hey there, Dr. Kraay.
Hi there. Thanks for having me again. And I do have to make one correction. The name of my university has changed since I was here last. So it's no longer Ryerson University, it's Toronto Metropolitan University. So yeah, different name, same institution.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Now, to be clear, what we're going to talk about, this has not been published in a paper yet, correct?
Parts of it have, but this way of sort of pulling the ideas together hasn't been published in this format, no.
Okay, good. So this is cutting edge stuff, and I know you'll enjoy it. All right. How did you first get interested in the topic of the multiverse and how it can be used as a response to arguments from evil?
Yeah, so I've been interested in the multiverse and its application to the philosophy of religion for quite a while. And since we talked about it before, I could mention, I was interested in whether the multiverse could be deployed in a response to this other argument for atheism called the problem of no best world. And I had done a little bit of thinking about whether it might also be relevant to the problem of evil. And at the time I thought, oh no, this really isn't going to make any significant difference to the problem of evil. But over the years, I've started to wonder whether that's correct. So I'm thinking now that there may be more of a role for the multiverse in helping theists respond to the problem of evil than I originally thought.
Excellent. So you've got some slides for us, and I'm just going to ask some questions along the way as we go through the slides.
Sure.
Let me go ahead and put those up now. And yeah, you've titled this, Can the Multiverse, what was the title again? Can the Multiverse solve the problem of evil?
Can the multiverse solve the problem? It's kind of a provocative question, right?
Yeah.
I'll try to explain, as professors always do, that things are really a lot more complicated than a simple question like that suggests.
Okay, so you start out with what you call the more familiar and the less familiar story about the multiverse. What is that?
Yeah, so I'll do this fairly briefly. I discussed this idea once before on your channel, but it just occurred to me that some of your viewers might be more familiar with hearing the multiverse used as a response to an argument for theism. So fine-tuning arguments, right? That's really a family of arguments for theism. But fine-tuning arguments say, listen, our universe is life permitting. It's biophilic, that's a technical term for life permitting. And things had to be just so for our universe to be life permitting, right? I mean, it had to be not too hot around here. It had to be not too cold around here. The earth had to be not too far from the sun and not too close to the sun, and on and on and on. There's all sorts of parameters that had to be just so in order for our universe to be life permitting. Right? So defenders of those arguments want to say that suggests that there's some kind of intelligent force or forces or intelligent design that ensures that the universe is life permitting. But a famous objection to this, perhaps the most famous objection to these kinds of arguments, invoke multiverses. And it basically goes like this. Well, okay, what if there are lots and lots of universes? What if there are billions, trillions, maybe infinitely many universes? And what if, just speculating here for a minute, but what if they varied in terms of all these parameters? Maybe they even vary randomly in terms of these parameters. Well, then it wouldn't be altogether surprising if at least some of them were life permitting, right? I mean, if the dials were set here, 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 in all these different universes, it wouldn't be a surprise at all if one of them turned out to be life permitting. So then it should be less surprising that a universe is life permitting, or perhaps even that our universe is life permitting. Anyway, the debate about this argument, of course, is more technical than I'm making it out to be, but the basic idea is that the multiverse is often used as an objection to an argument for theism. Okay, so that's the more familiar story. The less familiar story, right, is that it seems to me there are a number of philosophers who are interested in exploring the idea that a multiverse is what you would expect if God exists, and even that a multiverse or some sort of multiverse story can be used to respond to arguments against theism. So that's the idea. And I've done other work on using multiverses as responding to the argument, the problem of no best world. But what I thought we'd talk about today is the problem of evil and what role a multiverse might have in theistic responses to the problem of evil.
All right, before we get to responses to the problem of evil that involve multiverses, why don't you say a little bit about what the problem of evil is?
Yeah, good. So I've got a slide on that too. So of course I've got the word "the" in scare quotes here, right? It's a big mistake to think of the problem of evil as this one monolithic thing. Just like fine-tuning argument, really it's a family of arguments. Likewise, there's this enormous family of arguments that all fly under the heading of the problem of evil, right? But let me say a few things to sort of set it up and carve the terrain here. I think this will be pretty familiar to some of your listeners. So here's a very simple argument pattern that someone might offer, and it might start with a conditional claim like this, an if-then statement. Look, if God exists, then you wouldn't have this thing, this claim about evil. That claim would be false. But, second premise, but that claim is true. So therefore, God does not exist. All right, so that claim about evil that's sitting there in square brackets, what might that be? Well, simplest example would be the claim that there is evil at all. So that formulation of the argument would be, if God exists, then there isn't any evil at all. But there is evil, so therefore God doesn't exist. So that's one thing you could plug into the square brackets there, just the basic claim that evil exists. Or you could say that some type of evil exists. You might say, look, if God exists, there wouldn't be any pointless evil. But there is pointless evil, so God doesn't exist. So that would be an example of a type of evil. Or you might, as I say here, the fancy language here is token, but you might point to a particular instance. Somebody might say, look, if God were to exist, this specific thing wouldn't have happened. This evil wouldn't occur, but it did, or it does, and so God doesn't exist, right? So you might appeal to a type or to a particular instance, right? That's sort of point A there in the middle of the slide. The other way it can go is to point not to the mere existence of a type or an instance of evil, but rather to the amount of it, the distribution of it. Evil is very unfairly distributed, it seems. It seems like, the wicked prosper and so forth, right? So evil is unfairly distributed, someone might say, or it's too intense, or there's just too much of it, or it happens too frequently, or whatever. So any of those ways could be fleshed out and could be plugged into the square brackets there. So the basic idea is that the first premise says, look, here's this expectation. If there is a God, then we shouldn't have this. Okay, that this goes in the square brackets, and that could be fleshed out in a variety of ways. Second premise, the empirical premise is, but look, this really is, right? We really find the existence of evil, or the existence of this kind of evil, or this distribution or intensity or whatever. And so you get the conclusion that God doesn't exist. Okay, so there's a huge literature on these this kind of argument, as I'm sure you're aware, and I'm sure your listeners are aware. But not all arguments from evil are deductive. So a deductive argument is one that aims to show that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So it's this sort of strong, ambitious kind of argument. More modest arguments are inductive or probabilistic. They might try to show, for example, that God's existence is unlikely given this fact, or this claim anyway, about evil, given this claim about a type or an instance or a distribution or an intensity or whatever of evil. You might say the conclusion of an argument like that is more modest. It tries to claim that God likely doesn't exist. And another kind of argument, I'm just covering the ground very quickly here, but another kind of argument is abductive. That's a sort of fancy term for inference to the best explanation. So those arguments might say, well, look, the best explanation of this fact of evil is not theism, it's rather naturalism or something else, right? So there are a variety of ways to spell out arguments for atheism that appeal to evil. But if they're going to be arguments that appeal to evil, they've got to involve some claim about evil, and that claim about evil is either thought to be something that would not occur if God exists, or would be less likely to occur if God exists, or is better explained on some non-theistic worldview, right? Now, and I'll get to this a little bit later on, but probably the most famous type argument, that is an argument that appeals to a type or a kind of evil, appeals to gratuitous or pointless evil. And we did a whole interview with that, so I won't repeat what I have to say about that there. But the idea is that, sure, God might allow some evil if it had a point, but God would never allow pointless evil. That's a very rough and ready, non-technical way of setting out the idea. So that's like a little quick intro to arguments from evil.
Yeah, that was a great intro. And we said a lot more about this in the other interviews we've done. So, but I want to focus now on how the multiverse connects. So what's the general idea that motivates multiverse-based responses to arguments from evil?
Yeah, good. So a couple of quick terms here, first of all, before I get to what I think is the big idea here. So let's say that a universe is a spatio-temporally interconnected. So it's one sort of space-time unit. It's causally closed. There's no causal causation between different universes. So they're kind of disconnected, right? So that's what a single universe is an aggregate or a blob like that, a spatio-temporally interconnected region, let's say. And then a multiverse is just more than one of those, right? So a little bit of terminology, right? Philosophers love to talk about possible worlds. You and I have talked about possible worlds. So a possible world is a way that things could have been or might be. The actual world is the way that things actually are. If the actual world is a multiverse, what that means is there's more than one of these universes, more than one of these aggregates or blobs or whatever you want to call them in reality. Okay, if any possible world is a multiverse, that just means that there's one possible world that includes a bunch of these, more than one of these universes. Now, that's all very, very thin. This could be fleshed out in all sorts of different ways, and scientists have lots of more precise accounts of both universes and multiverses and how multiverses come to be and so forth and so on. But I think this will do for our purposes. So the idea is that there's more than one spatiotemporal unit of reality. That's the idea in a very small nutshell of what a multiverse is. And the only other preliminary point I'll make is that, and I'm not going to really defend the claim, but I'll just sort of advertise it or mention it. The claim in this literature, in this discussion, is that you can evaluate universes and multiverses. Maybe not you or I, but in principle, at least, you could say, oh, this is a good universe, or this is a bad universe, or this multiverse will be better than that multiverse, or this possible world is really quite good and this one is quite poor, right? You could resist those kinds of claims, of course, but they're pretty widely granted in the literature. So I'll just sort of take that on board, that it makes sense to talk about a good universe or a bad universe, or one multiverse being better or worse than another. Okay, so that's hopefully all the setup we need, but obviously feel free to jump in if anything there was unclear. Here's an analogy. My wife makes fun of me, when I go to a buffet, right? Because I'm always worried about making a bad decision at the buffet. So I'll get to a buffet, and I'll walk up and down it 2 or 3 times, and I'll think about how hungry I am and what I want to really put on my plate, and I'll think of. Meanwhile, she's already picked something and she's gone and eaten it all by herself, So anyway, I thought a buffet analogy might be useful here. If maybe you've had this experience, right? You might be at a buffet and you might think to yourself, if the only thing that I had to eat tonight was this one item on the buffet, the chicken wings or whatever, I don't think I'd have. If I had to pick just one thing here, I wouldn't pick the chicken wings. But it's a buffet. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet. I'm going to pick a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I'm going to put some chicken wings on my plate, because although I wouldn't pick them if I had to just pick one thing, I kind of enjoy chicken wings. I'm going to have some, even though there's all this other stuff, right? So hopefully that's a familiar and sufficiently intuitive idea. So here's a moral, right, that you might extract from that. In the buffet context, the application is always more controversial than the analogy, right? But in
Yeah.
the buffet context, you might say, look, something might not be good enough to pick on its own, right? If it was just chicken wings, I wouldn't pick them, right? But I'll have some chicken wings alongside my, lobster and steak and pad thai and whatever else there is. So it might not be worth picking all on its own, but it might be worth selecting as part of a larger group. Indeed, my meal as a whole would be better, more satisfying if I had a variety of different things on there, right? Okay. There's a long history in philosophy of the idea that more variety is better, all else equal. Sometimes that's called principle of plenitude, and that's sort of lurking in the background here, right? Now, here's one strong application. I started to worry whether I'd maybe phrase this too strongly here, right? But anyway, it's phrased pretty tentatively, so maybe I can get away with it. The thought might be this when we apply it, and obviously it's going to be more controversial, right? But the thought would be this. There might be some features of our universe, this spatio-temporal region that we inhabit, that you really wouldn't expect on theism if that were all that God were going to make. But if God's creative option include this much richer array like a buffet, it might be less surprising to find our universe as the creation of a divine being as part of a larger ensemble. So it might be surprising, right? It might even be, I put it a little strongly here, it might even be not worth creating on its own, but, and that's of course going to be controversial, but if it were part of a larger array, yeah, it would have a good place. Just like the chicken wings have a good place in your plate, so too one might say our universe has a good place, belongs, adds to the overall value maybe of reality by being part of this larger ensemble. That's the gist or the basic intuition.
Yeah. Okay, we'll definitely unpack that more, but I think this might be a good time to clarify a little bit. So you don't think that every response to arguments from evil that invoke multiverses succeeds, right?
Yeah, good. Right. So there are different ways. There are, I think, better and worse ways to try to appeal to multiverses. So I don't think all of them work. I've criticized some of them in print. I'll maybe say a little bit about one of them now, and then I'll try to extract a moral from that if I can. So this slide is supposed to be sort of like the hope. This is what ideally a multiverse model will do, right? But I don't think that. Hope always sort of comes to fruition in actual multiverse responses. So here's one, right? So in an interesting paper, a philosopher named Jason Megill said that the bare epistemic possibility, that means for all we know there's a multiverse, okay? So he thought, for all we know there's a multiverse, and he thought, given that, every argument from evil is going to be vanquished. Every argument from evil fails, given the bare epistemic possibility of a multiverse. That's a tremendously ambitious conclusion, right? So, and here in a very small nutshell is his argument, right? He said, well, look, our universe, for all we know, features more good than evil. So let's just talk about that for a minute, right? You might say, okay, maybe you think this local region of your life is pretty poor, right? Maybe you're having a really bad day. Maybe you're experiencing some more serious kinds of suffering. You might think to yourself, well, it's pretty hasty to extrapolate from that to the conclusion that our universe is bad overall or features more evil than good. After all, our universe is a very big thing, right? It includes all the past and the present and the future and so forth, right? It's very difficult to rule out the idea that our universe is good on balance, that it features more good than evil. Okay, so we could grant that, right? We could say, all right, for all we know, our universe features more good than evil. Even if things seem really bad in certain places and certain times, for all we know, the universe is on balance good. And then Megill's model of a multiverse is basically this. Every universe that has more good than evil, God creates and puts in the theistic multiverse, right? So any universe, that is more good than evil finds a home in the theistic multiverse, right? Okay, so here's the picture, right? You've got, billions and billions, trillions, maybe infinitely many universes. All of them are more good than evil, and that's the proper object of God's creation. Actually strikes me as kind of a lovely picture from a certain point of view, but I'm not sure that it works. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that in a way, it's not really an appeal to a multiverse, right? If Meagle wanted to block arguments from evil, and he thought that the arguments from evil really turn on the claim that it's not the case that there's more good than evil in the universe, then of course you could just reply and say, look, for all we know, there is more good than evil in the universe. And if you can make good that claim, then you can justify the conclusion that for all we know, our world is divinely created, or it hasn't been shown that it isn't divinely created, or what have you, right? So in a way, this argument, although it's officially about the multiverse, doesn't really seem to be about multiple universes. It's really just boils down to the claim that our universe is worth creating if it features more good than evil, and for all we know, it features more good than evil. So that's sort of one point. My other objection, which I think I made in the paper that I wrote on this, is that look, maybe that's too low of a bar, right? So more good than evil might be a necessary requirement for God to create a universe. It has to at least be this good, more good than evil. But you know what? It might not be enough, right? It might express a standard that is too low for God, right? Quick analogy, right? If I raise my children, you've got children as well. If we raise our children to be to be just barely more good than evil, you might think, well, we could have done better, right? There might have been things we could have done that would have made them a little bit better than that minimal threshold, right? Or if I get my teaching, change the analogy, if I get my teaching evaluations at the end of the term, and the consensus among my students is that I'm more good than evil, the chair of my department might say, you really ought to do a little bit better than that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So more good than evil is all well and good. Maybe it's a requirement, but maybe you'd expect God to do more, right? Maybe you'd expect nobody to suffer unjustly, or maybe you'd expect every instance of unjustified suffering to be redeemed or made whole, or made a person's life better off. Maybe you'd expect every individual person's life to be worth living. I could rattle off 10 or 20 different conditions that serious philosophers have expected, have argued, well, we should expect God to meet for any universe to be worth creating, right? So more good than evil strikes me as a bit of a low bar.
Okay. Why don't you say more then about those necessary and sufficient conditions, since this is a too low of a bar?
Yeah, good. So right, just to sort of unpack that. So, and this really is kind of what I used to think was going on with multiverses and the problem of evil. So that's why I call this slide one way forward, right? So here's a way the discussion, or if you like the fancy term for it, the dialectic could proceed, right? So someone who wants to offer an argument against multiverse theism could say, look, here are some requirements. In order to be included in a theistic multiverse, these things have to be met. And maybe Meagle's is one of them, more good than evil, but there might be a bunch of others. And I sort of briefly rattled off a few a minute ago, right? So that would be the first step. And that's kind of an a priori step. You sort of sit in your armchair and you say, now, what would we expect God's created universe to look like? What conditions do we think have to be met for God to create a universe and for it to be included in the theistic multiverse or whatever, right? Okay, more good than evil. Okay, nobody should suffer unjustly. Okay, but if they suffer unjustly, they should be compensated or whatever, right? So I've got in green here a couple of examples, right? More good than evil, that's Meagle's one. I mentioned already the idea that no evil should be pointless. I mentioned sort of in passing the middle one, that's the idea that something about that some conditions have to be met for the person who undergoes the suffering or the evil. Their lives need to be made meaningful in the long run, or they need to be compensated or whatever, right? The idea is that you shouldn't use people as means to an end. You can't use one person's suffering only to benefit other people. Some good should come out of it for them. All those kinds of thoughts can get parked in that second bullet point there. So anyway, here's how the discussion goes. Somebody says, all right, if a universe is going to be good enough to be made by God and included in the theistic multiverse, it's got to meet these conditions. That's sort of step one. And step two is to argue that, hey, listen, look around you, these conditions aren't met, or these conditions probably aren't met, or what have you. That's what the critic is going to say.
At least in our universe. Maybe they're met in other universes, but not this one. So this one
Right,
shouldn't have been
that's right.
included.
That's right. Because the other universe is good, really good point. The other universes are not spatiotemporally connected to us and they're causally isolated from us and so forth. We can't say a whole lot about them, but we're going to focus in the second step on our universe and say, look, our universe is not good enough to be made by God, right? That's the second step here. So you're absolutely right. We focus on this way of carrying on the discussion would focus on our universe, right? Okay, so how would the defenders of theism or the defenders of multiverse theism respond? Well, they might reject these conditions. They might say, so consider the no gratuitous evil one, since we mentioned it at the top, right? There are very serious philosophers who say that God's not under any obligation to prevent all gratuitous evil, right? So that would be an instance of saying, you know what? You, the critic, has said that God must meet this condition, but I'm rejecting that condition. I don't think that God has to meet that condition. That's an a priori discussion, right? And then, my indenting is a little garbled here, but anyway, the other move, of course, would be to say, look, I accept the requirements that you're setting out. I accept the necessary conditions that you have argued for, but you think that they're not met. I think, this is part A, I think that they are met, or at least I don't think that you've shown that they haven't been met, right? So that's another way of carrying on the discussion, right?
Yeah.
Now, all of that, though, really still focuses on our universe. And so there's a sense in which none of this is really, and this is what I don't think I saw when I first wrote on this stuff as clearly as I would have liked, none of that really is about multiverse accounts, because ultimately, as you pointed out, this is all a discussion about our universe. So what's changed, really, right? I mean, this is kind of the way the discussion, the argument from evil has always gone.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I used to think about multiverse responses to the problem of evil. I used to think that they didn't really add much because it was just a different way of framing the old discussion, right? Here are some things you'd expect if God exists. We don't find them, therefore God doesn't exist. But your expectations are wrong, or we do find them, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's the same old discussion. So that's one way forward, but I don't think ultimately that this way of setting out the discussion delivers on the promise, if it is a promise, that I tried to illustrate with the buffet analogy, right? There's nothing on this slide that really is about the role of other universes or the multiverse as a whole in responding to the problem of evil.
Yeah, you explained that super well, and I was thinking the same thing. Like, yeah, it's just kind of a different way of framing it, but it's really not about the multiverse. It seems like we're still stuck having the same kind of conversation we've always had about our universe. So,
that's right. And that's an important and interesting conversation, don't get me wrong, but there's nothing
right,
I think especially innovative or especially new about the multiverse in that. Yeah.
So are there multiverse responses that really appeal to multiple universes? Like it's about these multiple universes.
Yeah, so I think so, right? So here are a couple, just to kind of introduce. These are not my ideas, but I thought I would expose your listeners to them. So here are two very different ways of doing it. So Michael Almeida, a terrific philosopher from the University of Texas, holds a very controversial view. He thinks it shouldn't be controversial, of course, but I think it's a controversial view. And the idea is this. So by the way, I'm talking here about arguments from evil that are really about gratuitous evil, so arguments from gratuitous evil. So what Almeida thinks is that gratuitous evil is necessary. All of modal space, how do I put this? There are possible worlds that include gratuitous evil. Vast amounts, unbelievably vast amounts of pointless or gratuitous evil. So why does he think that? Ultimately, he thinks that because he has a particular kind of view about the structure of reality or the structure of modal space. I can define that in a minute if you want. That really is a kind of multiverse view. He calls it a pluriverse, and he's really working with the ideas of a famous analytic philosopher named David Lewis. So David Lewis had a view about possible worlds, which is that they were all concrete objects. Okay. So there are all these concrete objects, we can call them universes, that represent ways that things could have been. Okay? From the vantage point of any one of those, it's actual. From our vantage point, the other ones are non-actual. They're merely possible, but really there's no important difference between them. They're all kind of equally real. So that's a kind of multiverse story. And
I've never quite understood, which I won't slow you down. I've not quite grasped yet the whole it's actual from our viewpoint. Like ours is actual from our viewpoint, but from other ones it's not. I've not grasped that yet, but don't let me bog you down with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, maybe an analogy would help, right? On Tuesdays, Wednesday seems very different, right? But when it's Wednesday, that you say, well, that's today, right? Like today is today, no matter what day you express it, right? So that's what philosophers call an indexical, right? Here, the word here refers to wherever you happen to be standing, right? So the referent of that word changes depending on where you're standing. Likewise, actuality is supposed to function in the same manner, right? So what's actual depends sort of on what world you're in. There's no sort of special privileged actual in Lewis's modal system. Okay, so that's a bit of background. Hopefully that doesn't get too far into the weeds for people. But so Mike's idea is that gratuitous evil exists in some other possible worlds, and so therefore, if theism is true, God exists in all possible worlds, well, then it must be the case that God and gratuitous evil exist in the same possible world. There must be at least one world that includes both God and gratuitous evil. There is gratuitous evil in some worlds, and God exists. If God exists necessarily, God exists in every world. So guess what? They're composable. Okay. So if Mike is right about that, that blocks certain kinds of arguments from gratuitous evil, right? He's shown that there's no tension between the coexistence of God and gratuitous evil. That's an important result because a lot of arguments from evil assume that there's no possible way that God and gratuitous evil could coincide in the same world or coexist or be present in the same universe or what have you, right? So that I think really is it's an appeal to a kind of multiverse, right? A pluriverse, as he calls it. And it does do some work responding to certain arguments from evil. However, I think it comes at a cost. And the cost is this, right? And Mike will dispute that this is a genuine cost, but in any case, from where I sit, this is a cost, right? The idea is that our moral intuitions, I think, scream that a perfectly loving, perfectly powerful, perfectly good God could not allow, under any circumstances, certain kinds of evil, pointless or gratuitous evil, right? A God could never permit that. God would always find a way to preclude it, to rule it out, to redeem it, to prevent it, to minimize it, to do something, right? It's not like God wouldn't know about it, or it's not like God wouldn't be able to do something about it. So there's this costly conflict with our moral intuitions, I think, here about God. That God is supposed to be perfectly good and powerful and knowledgeable and so forth. And how could that sort of sit with pointless or gratuitous evil? In any case, that's a kind of conflict of intuitions that I have with Mike. But for sure, his attempt here is more far-reaching in terms of extending the discussion about the problem of evil into the multiverse. Okay, maybe that one was a little bit abstract for some folks. Here's, I think, a more straightforward one. Hudson has suggested that there might be justification for permitting certain evils in one universe where that justification appeals to multiple universes. So here's his analogy. Every philosopher has an analogy or a story. He talks in a paper, in a book chapter about the Museum of Wondrous Things. So here's the story. Somebody tells you that they're going to bring you to this amazing museum that features these incredible artifacts, and you go in and you're extremely unimpressed with these artifacts. They look ugly and misshapen and not worthy of including in a museum at all, right? But then comes the big reveal. You see, they've tampered with your glasses, so you're actually only seeing them in like 2 dimensions somehow, right? Once they outfit you with the proper eyewear and you can see it for all its wonderful dimensionality, you see it in 3 dimensions, or if you want to change the analogy, you see it in full color or whatever it is, right? You realize, these are really things of wondrous beauty, and the collection as a whole is magnificent for including all of them, and so forth and so on, right? Okay, so he wants to use this basic idea in a very targeted way, okay? He thinks that there might be certain kinds of pointless suffering, the suffering of animals, that's due to natural causes. He's very specific in his target here, that you might expect would count against theism. Oh, God would never allow this animal to suffer so pointlessly due to natural causes. God would never allow that, says the critic. Hudson wants to speculate that maybe God might allow those types of things because when you take the broader perspective, when you look at the extra dimensionality, when you see it in full color, those are kind of analogies, right? When you see the multiverse as a whole, you see that there are aesthetic considerations. The multiverse as a whole is somehow rendered more beautiful as a result of this suffering over here. And furthermore, that beauty serves to justify the suffering. Okay, now he's not saying this is actually the case. All he wants to show is that this is possibly the case, and that this might then be a way for theists to respond to certain particular versions of the logical problem of evil, right? So what this does for sure is offer a true multiverse response to the problem of evil. I mean, he's really all in, right? He's appealing to the to properties that can only be exhibited by multiple universes, as opposed to restricting his focus to just one universe or our local region or what have you, right? So that's what he's doing. And, if it works, it can establish the logical compatibility of God and some animal suffering due to natural causes, which would be an important result in the problem of evil discussion, right? Now, of course, it's going to be controversial. Someone might easily say, look, aesthetic considerations having to do with beauty are just not important enough, right? You should never let one being suffer for the sake of aesthetic considerations. Or maybe that's too strong, but at any rate, you should never let animals suffer for aesthetic reasons or something like that. You could resist the intuition here, right? So that's, I guess, what I mean in the bottom point on the slide here, that's a cost, right? That's a cost for our moral intuitions to say that God could allow some animal to suffer because of a forest fire or a hurricane or a tornado or a flood or whatever, for the sake of beauty that nobody in any particular universe can appreciate, but beauty that only God can appreciate, or at least some being that has the ability to sort of stand back and see the multiverse as a whole, or at least more than one universe. That's gonna bother people. I mean, for sure, right? That's gonna seem implausible to some folks. And then the preceding point I've got here is that, even if this works, right, it's still a very limited result in the problem of evil debate. It's only about a certain particular kind of evil, and it's a certain, response to it. But this still is nevertheless, I think, a genuine multiverse response to the problem of evil, or to one version of the problem of evil.
Yeah. What do you happen to know? I need to read this paper by Hudson. This is interesting. Do you happen to know what paper that is?
Yeah, so it's a chapter. It comes up in a few, and I'll put links in if you like in the YouTube. But it comes up in his Theism and Hyperspace book, or God in Hyperspace, if I've got the title right. So yeah, but I'm happy to put some links in there for folks.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well, we're getting near the end of the interview here. Let me ask you this: what are the advantages then of multiverse responses? Because in both cases, you said, well, here's a pro and here's a con. Are there any, I guess, advantages that don't have significant drawbacks?
Good, yeah, good. So some people might have been listening to what I said about Almeida and Hudson and gone, what is that it? Is that all you got, right? I mean, people who are going to resist these ideas are going to say, look, this isn't a very impressive result for multiverse thinking with respect to the problem of evil. Okay, so I guess what I officially, although I've offered some kind of obvious criticisms of these two authors, what I do want to say is that I think there's fertile ground here. I think there's more to be done. Okay, so let me try to flesh that out just a little bit. Right? As I said, I think there's something important and fruitful about this buffet analogy, right? it may be, and I think how I'm putting it here is a little bit more modest than how I put it earlier, right? But it may well be that the standards for a universe being worthy of inclusion are a little bit lower if that universe is part of a multiverse, as opposed to if it's just the only thing that God's going to make, right? That may be. I think that's a possibility that deserves to be taken seriously. I want to also plug a terrific paper. I'm going to mention it in a minute, but there's a terrific paper by John Pittard that's forthcoming in the journal Ergo, which I think argues quite compellingly that, in more technical detail that I'm going to get into here, but that argues for this idea that that the standards are going to be a little bit lower. That there's good reason to think that the standards are going to be a little bit lower for a universe to be worthy of being created by God if it's in a multiverse as opposed to just being on its own. Okay, so that's what I tried to motivate with the buffet analogy. And yeah, I really want to encourage your listeners to have a look at John's paper. I think it's terrific. So I've mentioned a couple of goods here that might sort of put some flesh on these bones a little bit, right? I said sort of very quickly in passing that the idea that diversity of certain kinds, all else equal, is very valuable, has a long and storied history in philosophy, right? So more variety is better is a common idea that kind of redounds through the centuries, right? So maybe there's some goodness involved in reality being more diverse by being a multiverse, right? Obviously, Hudson had his appeal to aesthetic value. Maybe there's more beauty to be found in a multiverse than in a single universe, right? Maybe you can get certain aesthetic features or aesthetic properties in a multiple universe scenario that you can't get in a single universe scenario, right? So that's some promise that the multiverse models have that involve goods that we know about. We already know that diversity is a certain good in certain cases, in certain ways, under certain conditions, whatever. You can philosophize carefully about it, right? But we already know that diversity is a good. We already know that aesthetic value is a good. But the multiverse offers a new way of talking about these, or a new way of appealing to these, right? Then, and I bet you some of your viewers were thinking this as I was running through it. Many of your viewers will have heard of the view called skeptical theism. So, skeptical theism, very roughly and informally, is the idea that there's much more to reality than we know about, and so we should be much more epistemically humble in our judgments, particularly our judgments about goods and evils and justifications, than we typically are. So the way I like to think of this is that the multiverse might well be a kind of force multiplier for skeptical theism, right? So I'm not going to run through all these theses here. Some of your readers or some of your listeners will know that these four claims are set out by Michael Bergman in a prominent defense of skeptical theism. But just look at the first one for a second. First one says, look, we have no reason for thinking that the possible goods that we know about are representative of the possible goods that there are. Okay, this is an idea that comes up often in discussions of the problem of evil. And when you sort of play with that idea in the context of a multiverse, in the context of an unfathomably large ensemble of different discrete chunks of reality, that thesis starts to look a little more plausible, right? It starts to look a little more plausible that although we know a bunch about good and evil in our kind of local region of this universe at this time, maybe we don't have any good reason to think that that adequately represents what there is to be known about good and evil and the justification of evil in particular in the context of a multiverse, right? If a multiverse view is correct, then reality is in a way far bigger than we ever imagined, right? Or ever imagined before multiverse theories came along. And so I think this might offer some, aid and succor for the skeptical theist. Now, skeptical theism is a hugely controversial view. There's all sorts of objections to it, as you know, and that's probably a topic for another interview. But in any case, I think that multiverse stories might fit well with a kind of skeptical theist response.
Yeah, I can see that. And I have done several other interviews, one with Justin McBrayer, one with John DePoe on skeptical theism. So go check those out. But let me return, if you don't mind, for a second to this first point. I know you said that there's this forthcoming paper that goes into much more detail, but can you hint at all at how one might go about defending that claim that multiverses would lower the standards for our or any universe?
Yeah, right. So yeah, very briefly, and really you should have Petard on to talk about it, but he argues that the consequentialist constraints and the deontological constraints are going to be lower, but the basic gist of it is going to be this, right? If all you can do is make one thing, then maybe the standards are higher than if you have a whole range of things that you're going to do, right? You might be, you might be. Again, I don't want to say that I'm in what I'm about to say that I'm representing Petard. I don't want to put words in his mouth, right? But you might be overall a better artist if you make more items, more artistic items that vary in various ways than if you only make one, right? If you're only ever going to, I mean, suppose you want a career as an artist. If you're only ever going to make one thing, you want it to be really, really good, right? If you're only ever going to publish one book, you want it to be really, really good. But if you're going to make a bunch of artworks, or if you're going to write a bunch of books, maybe to be worth making, they can be just a little bit less than if you're only ever going to do one. That's the basic intuition, right? As I tried to illustrate with the buffet analogy. And I think it has some intuitive plausibility. But for more technical treatment of all that, I certainly want to steer people to John's forthcoming paper.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, so we talked about the advantages of multiverse responses to arguments from evil, but did you want to say anything about, like, I guess you already mentioned some cost when you were talking about Almeida and Hudson. Before we wrap up, did you want to say anything about costs?
Yeah, so I'll briefly mention a point that Petard talks about in this paper as well. So he gets to worrying about the idea that there might be skeptical consequences of a multiverse, right? That a multiverse might, although it might have some advantages, might have some costs in terms of skeptical scenarios. So here's what he thinks about that. And I'll be very brief. And I want to encourage people to look at the paper for themselves here, right? So he says, look, scientists have told us for a while that there could be all sorts of crazy scenarios, okay? Even in our universe, but especially, as he argues, in other universes. So here's the concept of a Boltzmann brain. Somewhere out there in the deepest, darkest space, some particles might form together very briefly for like a nanosecond, and those particles might form a brain that has conscious experiences for a fleeting moment and then disappears. Okay, and those conscious experiences might look and feel exactly like our conscious experiences do. Okay, but they're different from us, right? They're not us. And so, of course, the worry is, how do you know that you're not a Boltzmann brain, right? It's a bit like the famous sort of brain in a vat scenario. How do you know that you're not a brain in a vat where some scientist is stimulating you to enjoy these experiences? Because your experiences would be indistinguishable. Okay. Or there could be universes that include beings just like us who were created 5 minutes ago but have these false memories of a past, right? I think that I had dinner earlier today and breakfast before that, so I think that I'm in a universe that's more than 5 minutes old, but maybe I was just created 5 minutes ago, and all this stream of memories is just sort of is not vertical, is false, and just began 5 minutes ago, right? So there are all these universes on lots of multiverse scenarios that includes all these things, all these beings who are only 5 minutes old but think they're much older, all these Boltzmann brains. And since there are so many of them in all these multiverses, in all these different universes, excuse me, this poses a skeptical worry. How do you know that you're not one of these, right? Okay, so why would someone think that they really are in a theistic multiverse? Well, those universes might be worthy of being included. Remember I was saying maybe the standards are a bit lower? Well, maybe they're low enough to include Boltzmann brains or characters who are only 5 minutes old but think that they're much older and so forth, right? After all, that adds to diversity, doesn't it? Right? After all, isn't diversity a good thing? And maybe they're not really harmed. They have false beliefs, but maybe they're not really harmed by that in any significant way, right? So Ordinary skeptical scenarios say, listen, here's a logical possibility, right? Here's a logical possibility. Maybe you're a brain in a vat. Okay, that's supposed to make us worry, right? But this scenario seems much more robust. It seems like, at least on many scientific accounts, we have excellent reason to think that in the fullness of time and across all these universes, there are many, many, many Boltzmann brains. Petard even goes on to argue that there's good reason for thinking that it's far more probable that on this scenario that we are in one of these deception scenarios than in a non-deceptive scenario. Okay. So that's a skeptical worry. And he thinks that this might even seem worse than an ordinary skeptical scenario, like, how do you know you're not a brain in a vat? How do you know you haven't been kidnapped by someone who's making you hallucinate all this or whatever? Okay. So all I want to say about it really is that the theist needs a way to respond to that, right? I agree with Petard that there's a skeptical concern that's raised here. So the theist needs to find a way to respond. One way to respond is to just say, look, worlds like that aren't good enough to be included, or something like that. The way, universes like that aren't good enough to be included in the multiverse, so we don't have to worry about this. Petard has a sort of spin on that. He argues that God wouldn't create beings like that. God wouldn't allow there to be Boltzmann brains or radically deceived 5-minute-old creatures or whatever, because doing that would make us less special to God. And all this worrying about these skeptical scenarios would block our trust in God, and that would somehow be an impediment to friendship with God. Okay. So I've only sketched this view. I haven't defended it or criticized it, but I think I certainly agree with this much. I agree with Petard's idea that the theist who's interested in a multiverse account of theism, but who wants to avoid this skeptical worry, needs to have some sort of reason for thinking that God wouldn't allow there to be all these kinds of creatures, right? And so he's offered one model of that.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. One thing that occurred to me as you were talking is if he argues that it's actually worse than ordinary skeptical scenarios,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that it is worse might be a reason for excluding such worlds.
Right. If it's worse for us somehow, that's right. If that's some kind of harm that God would want to prevent, if it's a pointless harm, then you might, I suppose, do it that way, right? That's not the route he takes, but that might be a route that you could take. Like God would not want things to be worse for us in that way, right? So he takes a related route, which is to say that this would make us less special, and God wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
Important
That might be the bottom bullet point might be why it's worse.
Yeah, that might be it. That's right. The first might be sort of the general structure, and this might be the more fleshed out version or something like that.
Yeah. But I thought if that point is correct, that might give reason why God wouldn't make it that way.
That's right.
But yeah, this is all really interesting, and I hope the viewers think about it more. Why don't you go ahead and we're at the end. Why don't you sum up for us, I guess, the big takeaways?
Yeah, good. So I've just got a few bullet points here to wrap up with, right? So I used to think, right, that the multiverse could make only a very limited contribution, or maybe no contribution at all, really, to the discussion of the problem of evil. Like I said earlier in the interview, I thought at the time that this would just be sort of translating the old arguments and responses into a new idiom, but no substantive change, right? I'm not so sure about that anymore. I do think that multiverse stories have at least the potential to help theists respond to various arguments from evil, right? My middle 2 points are really drawing out the lessons of that earlier slide, right? I think there more needs to be done for theists and non-theists to agree ideally on what conditions are necessary for a universe to be worth including in a multiverse, right? I don't think there's widespread agreement on that, just like I don't think there's widespread agreement on what conditions need to be met for God to ensure that people's lives on the whole are worth living or what have you, right? So I think more work needs to be done on the a priori front, and then I think more work needs to be done on the a posteriori front. In other words, to determine whether these conditions have been met or whether someone can really argue that they haven't been met or whatever. But that's, as I said, that's really the stuff about this universe, right? So what I tried to argue sort of towards the end of the interview was that really genuine, full-blooded multiverse responses won't just do that stuff. They'll have a broader appeal that invokes features of the multiverse. And I think unquestionably that's what Almeida's doing, and that's what Hudson's doing, and that's what Petard is doing as well. And so I encourage your viewers to check out those works. But I do agree with Petard that there is a chance of a skeptical worry here, that there's a promising argument that certain multiverse scenarios are going to heighten the threat of skepticism. And so theists need to find a way to respond to that or to defang that. And I think Petard's offered us one model for how that might be done, but I think there could be others as well. So ultimately, although multiverses have been bandied about in philosophy of religion for a while, I actually think that this is an underdeveloped area, and I think there's a lot more that could be said about this.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kraay, for coming on. I really enjoy every time you join me. And if
Likewise.
you're interested in hearing more from Dr. Kraay about the problem of no best world and how the multiverse can help solve that problem, then stick around because those videos are about to pop on your screen and you can click on them. Thank you for watching and keep exploring Christianity.